So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much to Diego for the introduction. So obviously the purpose of today is to convince all of you that the managerial skills of women are not worse than those of men. So that is something that I want to put forward even before I get started, and hopefully you'll all be with me by 1:30 today. So women businesses in developing countries, that's exactly what I'm going to talk about. Let me see if I get to the next slide. Is there a way I can do it myself? Plenty of buttons, but none of them. Okay, so maybe women don't have technical skills. That's already. There's another one. Too many different boxes. Great. Okay. So, first of all, if you want to, why do we care about a particular topic? So, if you take a look at microenterprise development, then the first difference or the first changes that are taking place is actually that it is a very important employment for women. So it's very common and it's growing in developing countries. So in particularly for women, and one of the reasons is actually that there are very few jobs in wage labor for women. So there are very few places where they can go and work as an employee, and that is one of the reasons why women are motivated to start working by themselves, starting little micro enterprises. So just to give you some ideas, worldwide, we're talking about 30% of the women being employed outside of, in micro-enterprises, of all of those who are not employed in labor force participation at home, so into farms. If we take a look at sub-Saharan Africa, the share is even 64%. So it's really a large share of women that are employed into micro-enterprises. So important is that there are very large differences between the businesses that are owned by women and the businesses that are owned by men. So that is something that worldwide you are observing. And so one of the big differences is that the men are much more likely to have an employee than the women have. So the women are more likely to be by themselves. And this obviously says something about the size of the businesses in which they are working. Other differences are the type of sectors that they are employed in, or also, for example, the amount of capital that have been placed into the different businesses. So all of these differences eventually lead to a large gender profit gap. So if you take a look at the earnings in businesses by men and the earnings in businesses by women, there is a very large difference between those. And it is important to understand where these differences are coming from. Because obviously, if we understand what the constraints are for women, it means that we can make an improvement. It means that we can help them so that their businesses can grow more as well. If, for example, women would start hiring employees, it's very likely they would hire other women, which would imply that we would also be able to create some additional wage employment for women. That is the reason that many researchers have been focusing on this topic in the past years. So even before starting to think about how we can grow a business, let's first think about starting a business and what the constraints are already there. So there are two very big contextual factors that play an important role. So the first one is legal discrimination. So in terms of business law, you actually see that these are becoming much more gender neutral over time. So men and women, they face the same constraints to a certain extent. But if you then take a look at family law, you still see that there are very big differences with respect to the rights of men and women. Just to give an example, in Cameroon, as soon as a woman gets married, all the property is actually under control of the husband. So it means she cannot sell, she cannot bind, she cannot use property up to the level that she actually wants to do so. And that is a very important constraint, because it means that if she wants to set up a business, she's completely dependent on her husband. Apart from that, we have the social norms, and a lot of social norms are related to gender. Okay, if you think about, for example, the context of India, many of the different women can actually not just go outside of the halls, set up their own business, move outside of the compound of the house. And that leads to a very hard way of setting up businesses, and especially if you want to think about more male-dominated sectors, where often, again, the profits are going to be a bit higher. Okay, so even before we think about growing a business, these are already two very important constraints. Then the final part is, of course, having the budget available to be able to start up your business. So there are three important aspects there. The first one is assets, the second one is savings, and the last one is capital. So if you take a look at asset ownership, again, there is a very large gender gap. Just to give you an example, in Uganda, you would have about 1% of the women business owners having a transportation tool available, think about a motorbike, think about a car, while about 47% of the men would have that. If you think about savings, which is an important aspect for the initial investment into a business, you would see that it's much more likely that the men have savings available than the women do. So this again implies that if they want to set up a business, they have to talk to their husband and hope that he is willing to support them. Then finally, if you think about capital, one of the good news is actually within this literature, which is the first point that I put down on the slides as well, is if you think about the mere access to finance, you actually see that the gender differences are disappearing. And the main reason for that is, of course, the existence of microfinance that over time has been focusing more and more on women. So if we talk about getting access to a bit of money, things have been improving. But obviously, if we're talking about having a sufficient amount of capital available to start the best and most profitable business, women still face a gap there. So very simple. Well, if capital is an issue, let's give capital to women, let's give capital to men, and let's take a look at what's actually happening. So unfortunately, the results were actually a bit disappointing because they're quite heterogeneous effects. So mainly what you see is that male but not female operated businesses actually gain from having access to additional capital. So what you see in this table, I won't go over all of these papers in detail, otherwise I'm afraid you won't have an afternoon to spend. So, but here you have in total 7 different studies which are taking place in 6 different countries. And the treatment was to an existing business, either giving them a grant, which could be just an amount of cash, or giving them in kind. And in kind means that you go to the business, you ask the business owner, what do you want to invest in? And instead of giving them the money to buy it themselves, you actually go buy the goods and then bring it to the particular shop. So a plus means that there is a positive impact on profits. All the slashes mean there is no impact. So you immediately see, if you take a look at the column of male and the column of female, that there is an enormous difference between the two. It seems that giving a grant, giving in-kind goods works much better for men than for women. And this is puzzling. Why is this the case? Why is it the case that women-owned businesses have a lower return to capital than men-owned businesses? And there we obviously come with the managerial skill. Is there a difference between men and women, or are there other explanations? And there are a set of other explanations that can be put forward. So the first one is in terms of human capital that people may acquire. So if you take a look at education, which obviously matters, being able to properly count is a very important starting point if you want to set up a business, we still see that there are very large differences. If you take a look at primary education, things are going in the right direction. So in terms of access to primary schools, you see that there's much more equality as of now between men and between boys and girls, I should obviously say. So there the differences are actually disappearing. But obviously, if we're talking about entrepreneurs as of today, we're talking about previous generations, previous cohorts, and there we still observe a large difference. So men are more educated than women are. Even as of today, we see that there's a difference in terms of primary education. If we want to think about higher education, there are actually still large differences between men and women. So thus far, it seems that the only difference that has been solved is with respect to primary education. The second aspect is skills. Skills mean having access to a formal network that can help you in acquiring some additional information, receiving formal training, just being a member of a network. This is all much more likely for men than for women. Okay, and so let this be the skills part, be the introduction to the network, because networks and information, that is where a very large difference still exists between men and women. So gendered networks take place not only in developing countries. There are researchers who have been taking a look at the US, and mainly what they see is that the networks of women are, first of all, much narrower, and are also much more homogeneous. And this is actually linked to lower business profits. If in addition to these smaller networks and the more homogeneous network, you in addition think about all the gender norms that I already mentioned before, then this leads to an additional barrier that actually comes in place for women, and that makes it much harder to set up their businesses. For example, women are not supposed to be in touch with strangers. So you can imagine if you want to set up a business, you want to increase your clientele, it's very difficult if you're actually not supposed to try to attract a new clientele to your business. In addition, if you want to think about getting access to more loans, it's important to have a large enough network that actually can help you in getting that particular access. And that is a very big issue for women. There is a study that is currently in the field in Africa that is actually linking men who are working in male-dominated sectors, and they're actually linking them to younger women who want to try to enter those sectors. And actually what they see is by talking to the community, they're able to break the barriers that are usually there with respect to gender norms, and they actually see that the first results are very positive. So the women who are within these sectors are indeed doing a great job. So the second aspect with respect to networks is obviously information. So if you want to set up a business, the first thing you're going to do is figure out where the largest profits are to gain. And that is, again, a larger problem for women than for men. If the networks are mainly gendered, it means that those sectors that are more profitable and are dominated by men, that it's also more men who will enter those sectors than women. And as a result, what you actually see is that there is a very large segregation across sectors. Just to give you an idea of how important this is, for example, in Uganda, there are researchers who have been looking at the garment sector, and what you see is that there are many, many more small businesses of women who are making clothes mainly for other women. While you would only have a couple of men within the sector, you would actually have a lot of women. But having a lot of women within exactly the same business, that means that there is much more competition, which brings the prices down and eventually leads to very small profits. Okay, so these are the systematic kind of problems that women are facing due to these two issues. The next aspect is the bias with respect to the allocation of household resources, which I personally think is one of the more surprising results within the literature, but extremely important. So first of all, there are differences between the husbands. Some husbands place a lot of restriction on the rights of their women. Other husbands allow much more decision-making power for their women. They're much more cooperative with the business of their wives. What you see is that if you have these cooperative husbands, you actually see that the businesses are doing better. Okay, so there's already a direct link that has been observed between cooperation within the family and the businesses that women can put into place. But one of the important results, and it's also one of the reasons why we saw the results in the previous table where women businesses were doing worse than men, is actually that there's a disproportional allocation of resources towards the business of the husband. So in the previous table that I've shown, mainly what they did is they gave the capital either to the women or to the men, and then they took a look at what happens with that women's or the men's business. So what were these papers concluding? That is, if we give it to the women, no differences in terms of profits. If we give it to the men, we see that the business is actually improving. So what these researchers did, they revisited these older papers, and instead of taking a look at what happens with those particular businesses, they took a look at what happens with the household income. And they actually see that there's no difference at all. If you give it to the women or you give it to the men, you see that the impact on the household income is exactly the same. So what actually happened within the families, that is that the women, they receive the money, but the money has been invested into their husband's business. Okay, so what this mainly means is that once the money comes to the family, maybe there is a discussion and they decide to invest it into the most efficient place, but mainly what you see is that this is almost systematically the business of the husband. Okay, so the reason why we observe that the money that was given to the women is actually not leading to a difference is simply because the money has never been used by the women. So a next step that the authors do, and unfortunately they only have a very small set of observations that they can use for this test, but what they did is they only keep the households in which either only the women or only the man has a business, so that the money had to be used by that particular business and could not be given to the other business. And there you see that the differences between men and women completely disappear. Okay, so if you give the money to a woman and the woman is the only business owner within the family, you actually see that she is able to use that money and to gain more profits in the future. Okay, so that is something extremely important. This is really talking about the distribution within the family and inefficiencies that may take place there. Of course, there's also a whole bunch of discussions that this can lead to. Maybe it is the best decision that the household has been taken. eventually, if the purpose is to make the household richer, you want to invest the money at the place that it's going to bring the biggest returns to capital. But if a woman systematically, because of that reason, doesn't get a chance to further build up her network, we're a bit stuck in a vicious circle in which she will never be able to break through. Okay, so that is something important to keep in mind. Then the final aspect is obviously the time use. If you want to start up a business, if you want to grow your business, you need time. You need time to think about what the next steps are. You need time to spend in your shop. If your customers realize that you're only there at unpredicted hours, obviously it's not going to be fruitful. So mainly what you see there is that women still bear a large responsibility in terms of the household chores. I just found some numbers for Cameroon, and mainly there, even if the woman is the largest earner within the family, you actually see that she's still taking 80% of all the household chores. So it means the husband is not working, and in addition, he only takes care of 20% of the responsibilities within the family. So if you then want to think about an efficient reallocation, reducing the number of hours that the woman spends in the family obviously could lead to a larger investment into the business and therefore most likely also household income. So childcare is then obviously one thing that comes into the picture because a big share of the time of the women is going to taking care of the children. So thus far, there are only studies in the US and in Europe, and all of those are positive. It mainly shows that once childcare provision is made available, you do see that it has a positive impact on the women's labor force participation. So I put a line under it, which is mainly stating, can childcare improve business development in Uganda? I'll be able to give you that answer next year, because we just started a study, actually this month, where we've been putting about 1,200 children into childcare in Uganda. And we're actually going to follow what the impact is, not only on the child development, because we do think it may be positive for the children as well, but we're especially going to take a look at what happens with the women's labor force participation. Okay, so just to see if even in the context of a developing country, is it indeed the case that if we free up the time of the woman, that they're able to join labor force participation to grow their businesses as well. So if you want to think about now, so we've seen now all the constraints, and the big question is, of course, how can we change things? So just a very quick summary of what seems to be working. So the first thing that seems to be working is providing access to a savings account to women. So the main reason why this works is because this gives the women more control over their income. Okay, so the whole idea is that if the woman is setting up her business, she's gaining some profit out of it. One of the big issues that she may be facing within the family is that the other household members are actually asking her for money so that she just has to give it away and is not able to reinvest it in the business. Giving her a savings account on which she is the only person who has control actually helps in making better decisions with respect to how to use the money. The second aspect that works is if you want to give a grant, it should be first large enough so that if others are trying to take a share of it, she at least can invest some of it into the business. And ideally, it's also in kind. Okay, if you go back a bit to the whole idea of money being diverted towards the business of the husband, imagine that the businesses are different enough and that different capital goods would be used in the husband and the wife's business. If you then give the right goods to the women, they will in fact be used in her business and cannot be diverted to the business of the husband. Then the final aspect is skill development, but skill development that focuses on a gender-relevant topic, which means not only telling them how to calculate, but really make clear how important it is to separate the budget of the household, which implies taking care of the children, taking care of your family members, from the business is one aspect of it. Second aspect is discussing cultural barriers. So cultural barriers exist, but discussing those both with women and with men. It's not something that women can solve alone. You also have to convince the husbands along with them. That's something that definitely can work at all. I don't know if there are people here from the ILO, but the ILO actually developed a set of skills that is the combination of business training with particular factors that can work on the cultural barriers. And David McKinsey, it's the last paper in the list, McKinsey and Puerto, they actually took a look at the impact of the program, and they do see that it makes a difference for businesses for women. So the interventions that had a limited success, there are also a bunch of them. The first one is actually, unfortunately, microcredit and small-scale cash grants. The main reason why these have been unsuccessful is because the money eventually gets diverted to the household. Does that mean it is not important? Not at all, because if a shock comes to the family, it is extremely important that the family has access to money to overcome those shocks, because otherwise these may have long-term effects that are devastating to the family. For example, one of the results is that if a family faces a shock, children are taken out of school and put into child labor. Taking them out of school is something very easy to do. Bringing them back to school is much harder, because once the family starts realizing the additional money is useful to the family, this may in fact not happen. Okay, so this is one of the aspects. Microcredit has its role, but maybe not in the development of businesses. Then the traditional business training programs that are focusing on calculus, etc., these seem not to work. And here we're talking about a bunch of projects, not just 2 or 3, but there are well over 20 studies that have been done, and there are actually very few results there. Just the formalization of the business alone is also something that doesn't work. Because obviously many of the women, they work in the informal sector. Just moving them towards the formal sector seems to bring about a lot of additional documentation, but not necessarily tools that actually can help them in further developing their business. So this still leads out actually a lot of questions, and how should we think about what works and what does not work? So if you want to think about what works, it obviously means that first of all, if you do an intervention and you see the intervention works, this first of all means that the constraint was binding to women, and secondly, it means that the intervention that you use to target that particular constraint, that it actually works. Okay, so that is what we know if an intervention works, but what does it know if an intervention does not work? That's a bit harder. Maybe it means that we were tackling a constraint which is not a constraint. Okay, if you, for example, see that business training doesn't work, it's mainly because the women already know how to do their calculus, and they're just not learning anything. Okay, the second thing maybe is that the constraint is binding, but maybe we're coming with the wrong program, the wrong intervention. So again, to use the example of business training, imagine that it is a problem and the women can learn some additional calculus. It seems that just giving them the basic training is not working, but if we give them a training and in addition aspects that focus on the specific needs of women, then we do see that it works. So it means that you also have to find the right intervention. So the last aspect is that it may be that the constraint is binding, it may be that the intervention you're testing is an effective one, but it may be that there are additional joint binding constraints that women face. Okay, and that is something very important to keep in mind. Maybe you've taken away one constraint, but taking away one constraint is not going to solve it all. If you think about a context where gender roles, for example, are extremely stringent, you can do whatever you want, as long as the husband is not supportive, as long as there is no openness towards women actually having a business, you won't change anything within that particular context. And in that sense, it's very important to mainly, before you start doing interventions, to mainly talk to the women and to actually try to understand what exactly the challenges are that they are facing. Okay, so just to go back to the example that we have of the childcare in Uganda, we knew that this is a constraint that often has been put into the picture, but before we started this, we went for a month to Uganda with the whole research team, and we've all been talking to different groups of women to actually understand what the main constraints are. And the two aspects that came out of that are indeed childcare on the one hand, and the other one is capital. So now that we put the whole intervention into place, we're going to do a combination of the different interventions. Some women will just get childcare, other women will get a business grant, and then there's a third group of women who will get a combination of the two. And if it is indeed the case that these two constraints matter at the same time, simultaneously, then what we expect is to see the largest impact of actually giving them the combination of the two. And this is something that should be developed and that should be taken into account for further development of interventions that may work to get more women into businesses. Good.
Thank you very much, Lore, for this very insightful presentation. We're going to open now the floor for comments and questions. We have about 25 minutes. So if you want to participate, please put up your hand and we will bring the microphone around. There's one question here, please. If you can please say your name and your affiliation so that everyone knows.
Hello, I'm Fenneke Rijssel. I'm here at the Institute, at the Department of Anthropology and Sociology, and the Research Director of the Gender Center. Thank you so much for this talk, Lore. I have, in my question, I have an anthropological head on. I think I was wondering what you do and how you take into account, I have 3 points, the unpaid family labor. I just recently finished research on micro businesses in Switzerland, and if the man sets up a business, the women is unpaid labor, whereas as the women sets up a business, no husband in our sample contributed free in the women's business. So how do you calculate profit? Then it comes also to the kind of businesses. You say grants in kind. What comes out from various research that I was involved in is that women set up services, type of beauty shops, nails, hair shops, laundry. So what is the in kind there in your research? The last point that I want to make, indeed, women, because they're also involved in care work, cannot put all their energies 100% in the business, so that might have an influence on. So you were talking about cooperative husbands. In which sense are they cooperative? Are they doing the care work? Are they doing the unpaid support in the business? The sort of are these parameters that you take into account in the research that you do and the measurements that you make?
Thank you, Fenneke. So, unpaid work by women. So, if we're talking about a husband's business, there are actually very few women who work within those businesses. So, you rather would see their father helping them, the son helping, the cousin helping. But you do see that there's quite a bit of segregation actually in many places. In India, this is almost 100%. In Africa, well, at least in the context that I've been working, being Uganda, a bit of Ghana, a bit of Tanzania, you see that there are already some changes, but mainly it remains something that's segregated. So the women would indeed focus on, as you mentioned in your second point, very often it's beauty salons, it's hairdressers, etc. But you do see that there's not that often a collaboration between husband and wife in a shop. We do saw one a couple of weeks ago in Bangladesh. It was actually, we were very surprised in seeing that. They also had an enormous shop actually, and they saw the benefit of doing that together. So when they did a study on giving the in-kind, I mean, a very good point you're making, it's obviously shops where that was possible. So they restricted themselves to shops where cooking took place, because then you could put some machines that help you, like putting an electronic blender, for example, instead of doing it by hand. It were shops where they could increase the goods that they actually would sell. But it's indeed the case that there were very few cases like hairdressers that were there. So that's right. That's definitely an important comment. Then on the husbands being cooperative, the main aspect that they've been looking at is the position of the husband towards the business of the woman. So it's not really in terms of necessarily helping them. That can, of course, be part of it. But it's much more seeing the benefit of your wife having a shop that leads to more profit for the family. Because in many places, one of the problems you would face is that it's fine that the wife is also earning some money, but it should not be more than the husband earns. So there is kind of a barrier on what is acceptable to a certain extent. And the more cooperative husbands, they would just see the advantage of having a combination of both income sources. So it's not really directly necessarily helping into the business, but it's much more being supportive. That has been used, I mean, both are of course important, but that is more the measure that they've been looking at. That's...
A few more questions here.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. My name is Claudia. I'm currently working with the ILO. I had a question about kind of the cover of what you cover regionally in your research. So it seems like it's mostly based on Africa and Asia. And I wonder if there are any differences that you observed in women-owned businesses in Latin America relative to these two regions. Thank you.
There were 2 or 3 questions, so let's gather maybe 2 or 3, and then we give the floor to Lore.
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Jacqueline, and I'm a PhD fellow at UNU Merit. Gender interventions are context-specific, and the inputs you have mentioned, such as education, access to finance, access to information, are relevant. But what about proper technologies? What about institutions' interventions? There is a case study from Brazil that shows that, for instance, when they have implemented a simplified tax regime, that a lot of companies have moved from the informal to the formal sector. And what about, why are you only focusing on microenterprises, which is only 10 people, and the geographical coverage? I think you're only focusing on rural rural areas instead of urban areas. So, thank you.
I think there was a third one here. Yeah, over there.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Shraddha. I'm a first-year MIA student at the Institute. Could you please expand on what kind of gender-relevant trainings are given to these people, specifically to men?
Okay, so thank you for the questions. So Latin America, so first of all, this is not only my research. If this was all my research, I would be quite a bit older. So, so it's a bunch of papers written by different people within the field. And it's a case, I mean, most of the studies actually took place in Asia and took place in Africa. Just to say, I mean, recently together with a colleague, we've actually been contacted by the Inter-American Development Bank to give them a literature review on what exactly has been done with respect to women businesses in developing countries, because they want to start doing interventions. So if you want, you can, there are 3-4 papers that I actually could identify, but not more than that. But feel free to drop me an email, and I'm very happy to share those papers with you. I have the references in my office. But so in general, there has been much less research done, and I think one of the reasons is that gender equality is already a bit better, at least in Latin America, as compared, especially to Asia and Africa. It's a bit mixed, depending on the context in which you work. But so there are some studies, but they're actually not that much, and that's also why I didn't cover them. I didn't cover them here. So with respect to the tax regime, so and the context that we're working in here, so it's both. First of all, it's both a combination of urban and rural. If you want to think about competition, if you want to think about growing businesses, there's actually much more scope in urban areas than there is in rural areas, because in rural areas within a village, you would have 1, you would have 2 shops, but not more than that, because there's simply not enough clientele. So we're actually talking about urban and semi-urban areas in most of these cases. Then we're indeed focusing on micro-enterprises, because for a very long time, I'm not sure at this point if this is still a right thinking, but for a very long time, these were actually the businesses where people saw the most potential for growth. And I honestly think that it's indeed the case that there's a bit of a stepping down from that belief towards focusing more on the slightly bigger enterprises, let's say 10 to 50 employees. But obviously, if you then want to talk about doing experiments with these enterprises, if you want to think about interventions that can help these enterprises, we're obviously talking about very different budgets as well. Okay, and so given that these small enterprises were a way of feeling, well, as said at the very beginning, many women don't get access to wage employment. This is a way that they would come up with their own solution to that problem. That is why they mainly have been focusing on these small businesses. Also, if you start taking a look at slightly larger businesses, you do see that the share of women managing it is actually heavily going down. Okay, while in the micro enterprises, you still have a lot of women being involved. You see that share drops heavily if you go to slightly larger enterprises, because it brings about a whole new set of issues, and one of those issues may be dealing with the tax regime. It's true that if you make it easier, it's easy to make it accessible, but in many of the countries that we've been working in, what you mainly see is that you can earn quite some profit before you actually start paying taxes. And the main reason is that it's not profitable for the government bothering about these small enterprises, because it takes them more time and effort to get those taxes, and they eventually get money. So many of these businesses, even if they would become formal, they actually still would not pay taxes, because they would be below the minimum rate that is put into place. So that's also, I mean, but that obviously links closely together with the focus on smaller businesses. Then the last point, which is the gender-relevant trainings given, it's actually quite a large set. So there are papers who would just be focusing on cultural barriers, talking with both men and women, convincing them that these are norms that do not necessarily, I don't want to say make sense, but that may be a bit outdated, and that particular benefits could come to the household as a whole by opening up the possibilities that women have. Very often what you also face is that men, for example, would think that their women cannot work simply because other men think that that is the right thing for their wife to do, and they don't do it because they are not supportive, they don't do it because they think the others will never agree on them doing so. So they did at some point an experiment in Saudi Arabia where they mainly asked to the different men, like, would you be fine in your women working, in your wife being employed? And they asked that to a group of men, and they actually saw that the share of men in the group that agreed on that was much larger than what every man thought that the others would answer. And then after that, after doing that experiment, after the revelation that many more men agree on their women working, this was, by the way, in Saudi Arabia. So if more men agree on their wives working, then as a result of that, they actually saw that the people who participated in their experiment, they were more likely to enroll their women to offices that would help them in finding a job. So a lot of it also has to do with perceptions, and that is one of the things that gets worked on. Then the final aspect is much more has to do actually with confidence. A study took place in India where you tell children in school, oh, you know that girls are worse at maths than boys. If you tell them that right before they do a math test, they're going to do worse on that math test. So this is just that there's also a lot that works in the perception and the confidence that we have about what is our role in the society, how exactly should we work on that? And these are the type of aspects that they're going to work on. They're going to try to change the confidence on women, the perception they have about their own capabilities, etc. And that's it's a whole literature. There are quite some papers done, and a lot of that actually goes closer to psychology than to economics. But it's definitely I'm happy as well to point you out some references if you want to read more about that.
There was a gentleman at the back.
Thank you, Lore, for your presentation. My name is Enrico Nano. I'm a PhD student in development economics here at the Institute. As you just mentioned, psychology, I have a question regarding a potential for gender behavioral differences. Like, it is a fact that women are more risk-averse than men. So I was wondering if returns and profits might be affected by this also in developing countries, because this is a general fact found in the psychological and behavioral economics literature. Thank you.
That's another question here.
Hello, my name is Charlotte Feldman. I'm an intern at Untitled, and my question would be, you've mainly been talking about women who are married or at least depend on the men in their environment to because of their living, but what about single women like widows or young women who aren't married yet but aren't living with their family anymore, because there are more and more of those, especially in the urban areas in developing countries. So yeah, just what about them?
One third question here.
I'm Alva. I'm also an intern. I'm working with Plan International, and we're actually doing a lot of work on economic empowerment on girls. So I have a question that goes from what you were talking before. You were saying that there's this perception that starts by talking to girls, and also following up on your comment on young women, and what about women who are not married? I'm wondering, knowing that a woman's likelihood of being in a business starts from childhood, for the same sense that it depends on the level of education, it depends on the cultural and societal norms that they have been exposed to. I wonder, how do we integrate girls to the discussion of women empowerment in terms of economic empowerment? And from your perspective, what do you think will be strategies to allow girls to reach financial independence once they are adults?
Okay, so let me start with the easiest one. Enrico, well, it's also the first one that was asked. So are women more risk-averse than men? They are. That's absolutely the case. So it's something that I indeed didn't mention. I kept out a bit, being the bad economist, I kept out a bit more of the psychology in the presentation. But this is a very good point. It's definitely the case. If you give an amount of money to women and to men, men are going to be willing to take much more risk with it. And obviously, that can lead to higher profits in at least some of those firms. But obviously, if you take more risk, so if you take a look at these studies, we're mainly taking a look at the impact on averages. And so the risk averseness is going to explain to a certain extent the broader differences that you observe in profit outcomes for men, while for women you see less of a difference, mainly because they're choosing for safer options. But yes, that's definitely an aspect that women matters. Then what about single women, widows, so everyone who is not married yet? So in Asia, that is a bit trickier. Like if you again go back to places like India, a woman, at the moment that she gets married, she's going to move to the village of her husband. Okay, so which mainly means that starting up a business before that is not necessarily a good investment, because in any case, as soon as she gets married, she's going to move. And in India, rural areas, women definitely still get married. Finding single women in urban areas is also rather going to be rare. It happens, it starts happening more, but in that context, eventually women get married, and if you don't get married, it's much harder to have your position within the society. It's a very different story if we go to Africa, and actually one of the main reasons that in Uganda we saw that so many women are responsible for the children is because very often at some point the husbands disappear out of their lives. Okay, so they decide to move, they migrate, and they no longer actually take care of the family. And many of the businesses that we observe there are actually businesses that are led by single mothers. Okay, and then one of the reasons that it's so hard to combine both is that on the one hand, they have their clientele, at the same time, they have to look after the kid who is mainly playing in the street. Because the eventual solution that they have is taking the child along with them. And if that is a 1 year or 1 year and a half old, it's not that much of a problem because they put them on the back. If we're talking about 3 to 5 years old, it actually means that the children are playing around in the streets, which is not good for the child and which leaves a lot of responsibility on the mother. That kind of takes away her attention from the shop. So we're talking about being married. Being married gives the advantage that, let's say, that 20% of the household chores are going to be done by your husband. Okay, maybe he also brings some more work. That's something to take into account as well. But at the same time, it does imply that there is a bit of help. While for single mothers, many of the constraints that I mentioned before are actually even more a constraint. Think about finding access, getting access to capital. Think about getting a house to work from. Think about taking care of the children. All of this is suddenly falling on the shoulders of just a woman. So it's very similar in terms of the constraints we face. And for example, in the Uganda sample, we're going to have both. So we're going to be able to take a look at whether there are different impacts of childcare for women who are single mothers and for women who have at least some support of their partners. Then how to bring this into the thoughts of girls. So I think that, I don't know much literature that really looks at how to somehow prepare children for what could be the future in terms of owning businesses, in terms of being more independent. But one thing that obviously plays a very big role is aspirations. So seeing role models, that makes a very big difference in terms of how children already perform at school. There is, for example, a study, this one is in India again, where at some point they started creating call centers within the villages, which actually led to a very nice job opportunity for women, because it was a possibility within the constraint of the gender norms, because they could actually work from home or from a center within the village where many women were gathering. But at the same time, they actually were getting very well paid because these were international firms. But obviously, they needed a particular level of education. They needed to speak their languages. And they did a study on the effect of that on the aspiration of girls, and they actually see that girls that start doing better in school, they're more interested in learning English, they're more interested in staying longer into school. And in that sense, aspirations can play an important role. Imagine that you suddenly have a super great businesswoman sitting in the village. That's going to have its impact on the children, on the belief that they may have with respect to their future. And in that sense, that can obviously play an important role. Then there is also a study in Tanzania that just came out that's taking a look at 18-year-old girls. So just at the end of secondary school, they're giving them two trainings. They're giving them a business training again, so a bit thinking about starting your own business. And at the same time, they're giving them a training on thinking about postponing getting children. Okay, because very often they get married and right away they get children, or they don't get married and they already get children. So they're combining these two types of trainings and are actually taking a look at what the impact is of that with respect to the girls first starting up a business before they actually start thinking about having a family. And the first results are very positive. They're still having a second round into the field, but the very short-term impact is actually positive. So this is also a way that you could think about, I mean, these are not children, but thinking about adolescents and how to try to at least make them aware about different futures that may await them. How much is possible in practice is obviously still the question.
So we have 3 final questions, one there, another one here in the front. Yeah, let's start with this one.
Hi, my name is Katarina, and I have a question about the importance of perception, of people's perception in on women business in developing countries. So if we have a buyer and there is a business, two business, one run by a man and other run by a woman, what's the likelihood of this buyer buying from a woman? And what if this woman is, for example, divorced? Thank you very much.
And actually following on from that, here.
Sorry.
Atlanti Moquette from Giving Women. Following on from that, you've talked a lot about, small shops, the kind of village shop and so on. We've been involved with a project in India which has been breaking the norms of what are the traditional roles of women professionally. And the organization that we've been working with is Women on Wheels, where they've taken the women from the slums, without any, really the poorest of the poor, and have been training them as taxi drivers. And the effects of that training has gone far beyond formal training. The formal training, it's going to be, it's built up confidence, and many of them leave and do other jobs after that, but it's breaking those cultural norms, which was quite difficult. And there was recently a conference exactly on that, on are we just looking at one thing for economic autonomy for women at the bottom of the pyramid, and are there other possible options for that?
Thank you. I would really ask maybe Laura to answer these questions, because mine is more to all the audience here. So I'd really ask you to answer those questions first, please. Thank you.
Yeah, and let's only final one here.
The button? Is it okay? Good. I have a question and I'm asking for your help. I'm running an NGO in Switzerland. We have grant in kind for students in Senegal, and we are asking for students to apply to get those grants to create their startups. 3 years ago, we had 3 ladies, 3 men. 2 years back, we had 1 man, 2 ladies, and this year we only had 6 men. What can we do that in 2019 we get more women applying and not being scared? Do you have a hint?
I can go there and arrange it. I'll take it last. I have to think a bit about it. I can try to do that while answering the other questions. So talking about perceptions, the 2 questions are a bit close, right? Talking about perceptions, talking about cultural norms. There are very, very, very few studies that have been done on this. And I agree it's a very important question. And just as with the answer of does childcare work in Uganda, I hope to be able to answer that to you next year, because we're actually starting this up in Bangladesh. So what we're doing in Bangladesh is we're working together with Bcash, which is BRAC's financial arm. I'm pointing at BRAC because there is some very hidden publicity made there at the bottom of the screen. So, and they're actually starting mobile money. And one of the problems they're facing is that it's working very well, but it's working well for men, it's not working for women. And financial inclusion over the world has been increasing a lot. But if you take a look at the numbers in Bangladesh, the gender gap is now enormous, simply because men take it up, women do not. And one of the main reasons why they say women do not want to take it up is because they always have to face a male agent instead of a female agent. So in collaboration with BRAC, what we're actually going to start is we're going to put female agents in place. And the only way that we can do that is all the money, the banking transactions is actually happening to shops. And the only way we can do that is by getting women employed into shops. And we're going to have areas in which we put an additional female employee. We're going to have areas where we put an additional male employee, and we're actually going to be able to study what the impact is for the shop, but then obviously also what the impact is for the transactions done within the banking sector by women. So is this going to work? Is this something difficult to do? It actually is. So usually when you start a study of this scope in a developing country, you obviously think well about the intervention, you talk to people to see if it is relevant, and then you just put it into place. In this case, we're very worried that we're actually doing something that may be hypersensitive. How can we be sure that this is not going to have a consequence for women? Because maybe they're breaking particular cultural barriers that are even much stronger than we imagine them to be. So mainly what we're doing in this period, we're starting a very, very small pilot with just 15 women, where we're going to observe and going to keep very closely in touch with them to actually be sure that they're safe. And even June, we conclude that this is going well, so we set up a helpline for them. They're going to start working in the coming 2 months, we hope. If that, once we see that that is actually working, we're going to scale this up to 225 women. There are very few studies. We know that it is very important to know the answer. Bangladesh is in that sense also a very good country to test this, because the gender norms are quite strict. But I cannot give you the answer yet, because there's nothing that is done of that sort. And if it is, it's beyond my knowledge. And then I definitely would like to know, because it may have a consequence for what we're going to put in place in Bangladesh. So it's a very hard one. It's difficult to know, but we're trying to see how we can break those norms. It seems, I mean, like the result in Saudi Arabia is quite. I did not expect this at all. I did not at all expect that just by telling the men, like, well, other men also think that their wives can work, that this already would make a difference in terms of getting more women to work. And they did this now also with a small pilot, but they're now doing a new experiment that actually covers the whole country. So to see if this still holds if you do it on a larger scale. So there are studies on the way that may give a bit more insight with respect to that. And then you want to get more women to apply. Why don't you do it for women only? As a first stage, I mean, just to see. Because one thing is, do the women feel the constraint because they simply don't dare because they think it's not their position, or they don't do so because they think the men are going to be better and they're going to be the ones getting it. So if as soon as they get a feeling of competition, women react very differently than men do. Men may get excited, women may take a step back. So one thing to do, that's also what we do if positions get offered, get opened here, we say like, and we highly encourage women to apply. So maybe it's not bad to make it very explicit, or say that the grants will be divided between men and women, and then they know that it's a different pool that they apply to. And if that doesn't work, I'm very happy to think about a solution for 2020.
Okay, on this note, thank you very much, Lore, for this insightful presentation. Please join me in thanking Professor Vandewalle for the presentation. And thanks to everyone for coming, and especially those who participated. We look forward to seeing you in future lunch briefings. Thank you very much.